Hi there, my name is Lindsay and you're watching Lindsay Adventure and this is going weird. Okay, there's the light. The light is better. And today we are adventuring through another Bible story just like we do every single Friday. So today, before we actually get into the Bible story, I want to tell you a story that happened when I was a teenager. So when I was 14, my family and I moved out to a country near Australia that's called the Solomon Islands, and we became missionaries. So I was a mission kid at the ripe old age of 14, and for about the next 2.5 years we lived out there. And I think about in the first few months, somewhere in the first year that I lived out there, this story happened. So we lived at a little place called Artawifi Hospital, and it's a Seventh-day Adventist hospital, and my dad was in charge of running it. And this hospital has a nursing school, so there would be, students in their 20s coming from Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Vanuatu, and across the Solomon Islands, and they'd all come together and they would learn how to be nurses for the next 3 years. And so part of the program was the pastor of the hospital, he would take a group of the nursing students off into one of the tribal villages, and they would help throughout the day. They would do clinics, taking blood pressures and whatever nurses do, and also helping with the gardens for the local people, and building huts, doing anything, manual labor type of thing that they might need in the local village, just helping the people in any way that they possibly could. And then in the evenings, they would have what they called leaf hut, which is where they would all gather together under this big long hut with no walls, and the pastor would get up in the evening and do his evangelistic sermons. And so this would go on for, I think, a week. And so one of the evenings during this particular week, the chief of one of the local villages, he came running in, and he was also known as the devil priest. So he was the guy to go to if you wanted to curse somebody and kill him and all that kind of stuff. Just happened every day of the week out there. So this guy is the devil priest, and he comes running in one of the evenings, and he's actually carrying his little girl. She's about 8 or 9 years old, and she's dead, and he's obviously very distressed. He's not there to be cursing anyone. He's just there, can you please help me? And so they stop the program and pray over the man and his girl, pray for healing and for life and whatever can be done. But because she appears to be dead, but there's no doctor in amongst them, and they're kind of, representing the hospital, they say, we can't just pronounce her dead. We actually have to have 2 of our nursing students take her down the mountain, across the water and over to the hospital, and have the doctor who's there, have him pronounce her dead. So that was the next thing that they had to do. And so 2 of these nursing students get her on a stretcher and they start walking down the mountain, and a couple hours later they get halfway down the mountain and the girl sits up and coughs and asks for food and water, and the 2 nursing students are a bit taken aback. They're like, oh, okay, well, she's clearly not dead, so we should probably take her back to the village. So they turn around and go back, and when they come back and the father is there and he is overjoyed because, his daughter is alive and the prayers were answered, and, it's this great miracle that's just happened, he on the spot decides, you know what, I'm not going to be a devil priest anymore. I'm going to be a Seventh-day Adventist, and I'm going to start a new village of Christians, Seventh-day Adventists, and we're going to go live over there. Just complete 180. And that was amazing. It was a miracle, and it meant that the gospel moved forward, and the daughter was alive, and the devil priest became a Christian, and happily ever after, really. So this was a really cool story that happened when I was like 14, 15 years old, and I got to hear it like in the next couple of days after it happened, because I personally wasn't on that trip. But yeah, so that brings me to a story. I wonder if you have made any connections as I was telling this story. Can you think of any stories in the Bible that sound similar to this? So we're going to be looking at Mark chapter 5, verses 21 to 43. And so this story, I'm going to read it, I think. It's about 2 women who Jesus heals. And we're going to learn some lessons out of it. So this is after Jesus has gone and healed the demon-possessed man and the storm on the Lake of Galilee and all this kind of stuff. And now he's back. And so in verse 21, it says, "Now when Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered to him, and he was by the sea. And behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came, Jairus by name. And when he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged earnestly, saying, 'My little daughter lies at the point of death. Come, lay your hands on her, that she may be healed, and she will live.' So Jesus went with him, and a great multitude followed him and thronged him. Now, a certain woman with a flow of blood for 12 years, and had suffered many things from many physicians, many doctors, she had spent all that she had and was no better, but instead grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment, for she said, If only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well." Immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" But the disciples said to him, "You see the multitude thronging you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see her who had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." While he was still speaking, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house, who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not be afraid, only believe." And he permitted no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Then he came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and saw a tumult and those who wept and wailed loudly. When he came in, he said to them, "Why make this commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they ridiculed him. But when he had put them all outside, he took the father and the mother of the child and those who were with him and entered where the child was lying. Then he took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cumi," which is translated, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." Immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age, and they were overcome with great amazement. But he commanded them strictly that no one should know it, and said that something should be given her to eat. So there's quite a few little correlations in there from the story I just told. I have some points that have stood out to me as I've been reading that story this week, and I'd like to share them with you. So, first of all, we're looking in the book of Mark. This isn't the book of Luke, where every second story is about women. So this particular story is quite remarkable, because we know in Bible times, and throughout the ages, women haven't been particularly well regarded or worth talking about in a lot of people's minds. So for Mark to be telling this story where there's two women or two females in a row, it's something to certainly take notice of. He also, I have all these different points I want to bring out, and I don't know which order to do them in. So another important thing about this is the woman who was bleeding, so the woman who was bleeding, we can very easily assume that this has to do with like a period bleed that just keeps on going forever. We know today that there's a few different conditions that we could diagnose her with, and she would certainly by this point be very anemic and have very low iron and be completely weak. And over the years, she spent all of her money to, get help for this situation, but she's just getting worse and worse over the years, and she would probably be almost at the point of death herself. Like, she can barely crawl. I'm imagining her crawling through the crowds to get to Jesus, because she just doesn't have much energy to actually walk, in a normal kind of way. there's the other, the little girl who we're looking at here, is considered to be a corpse, right? So she's dead. Even though Jesus is like, no, she's just sleeping. You know, the way we look at this is she's actually dead. And for both the bleeding and for the corpse, they have these purity laws back in those days that were given by God. So a woman who is bleeding will be impure, considered impure for 7 days, and needs to be away from everyone and not contaminating everyone with her, you know, the bacteria that feeds on the blood and all that kind of stuff. And a corpse, in a similar way, if somebody touches a corpse, they have to be considered impure for 7 days and, you know, basically self-isolate. There's a lot of self-isolating that's supposed to be happening here, but instead everyone's kind of like gathering around. So these are, yeah, two stories that are like put right next to each other, juxtaposed next to each other. And yeah, so we see impurity, we see talking about women and girls. There's just all of these really untouchable subjects all kind of thrown into the mix together. And then the first person that we really see coming along is this leader of a synagogue. So he's not necessarily a Pharisee or a Sadducee or anything like that. He's just a guy who is like the local church, like elder, probably, is probably a good way to look at it. So he's got a position of leadership. People look up to him for him to like run the show each Saturday. And yeah, considered to be a man of faith. And he has enough faith to come to Jesus in the first place and say, hey, can you please help me? My daughter is, you know, nearly dead. And so he has that much faith. But the thing that actually, before we get there, let's talk about something else. So I studied theology a couple of years ago at university, and there's this thing about the book of Mark, which is called the Markan sandwich. And that sounds kind of funny, but basically what happens many times over in the book of Mark is that Mark will talk about one story, and then he'll talk about a completely different sounding story, and then follow it with like turning back to the first story. And when you see those three parts together, it actually makes one bigger story that you can look at, and kind of the story in the middle, so the second one, often helps give you clues to sort of unpacking what's going on, what Jesus is saying in the other parts. So we can see this literary structure in this particular story in verses 21 to 43, where we talk about Jairus and his daughter, and then that's interrupted by the story of this woman who's bleeding, and then we go back to the story of Jairus and his daughter. So there's this Markan sandwich going on, and it's this whole, you know, bigger story that we can sort of unpack, and that's great. So take that when you go and read through the book of Mark, go and see what other Markan sandwiches you can find, and let me know in the comments, yeah, which ones you found recently. So, Jairus, he asks Jesus to come and lay your hands on my daughter and she'll be made well and she'll live. And when Jesus hears that, he just follows him. And he starts walking, you know, completely surrounded by this whole mob of people. But he doesn't say anything, I noticed much later. After I read this about 4 or 5 times, I'm like, oh, he doesn't say anything the first time around. He just follows him. And then they're interrupted by this woman and her healing, and say this. There's so many things. Okay guys, so I paused the video, paused the recording so I could like gather my thoughts, because there's just so many directions I wanted to go in all at once, and I think I have a plan now. Okay, so Jairus asks Jesus to lay his hands on his daughter, but then we see in the story that follows immediately, with this woman who's bleeding, she doesn't even ask Jesus. Then, how am I going to say? She believes within herself that all I have to do is just touch his garment, just touch his clothes, and that will have power enough to heal me completely. And so we see here the belief systems that are going on in each of these two people and what kind of comes of them. So because this woman, I wish she had a name, let's call her Judy. I don't know, that just popped into my head. So Judy, she's coming up behind Jesus, and she reaches out and she just believes that if I touch his robe, then I'll be healed. And that's exactly what happens. She touches him, and Jesus doesn't even see her. He doesn't participate in any kind of way. The power is just immediately attracted to this woman's belief and her faith, and she is healed. And so with Jairus then, Jairus is like, so worried about his daughter, and he's doing things the right way. Laying hands is a pretty common thing for people to do throughout the Bible. We see laying on of hands quite a few times throughout the Old Testament. And it's meant to heal, it's meant to commission, it's all these different things. And so Jairus is, going about the right way. He asks Jesus to come and lay hands on his daughter, and then she'll be fine. Like, that's just the way things work. And he doesn't have this, anything more personal to hold onto, to ask of Jesus, to want from him, because he's like, this is just the formula, right? This is how it works. I am the leader of the synagogue. I know these things. And so Jesus, we said he doesn't speak. He just follows Jairus, and then they encounter this woman who believes so much in just touching Jesus, because there's plenty of power just flowing out of him, that'll heal me. And it does. And so Jesus stops and he engages this woman and says, who was this? I need to, speak to her. I need to encourage her. And so she comes forward, she tells the story. She's, fearing and trembling because, like we said a minute ago, she's considered impure, and now she's, worried that, oh no, all these people who I'm surrounded by, who I'm supposed to be socially distancing from, basically, they're all being contaminated by me. If I just didn't come, then, they wouldn't be contaminated. I wouldn't be putting anybody out. But now I've contaminated them, and they're going to have to go and be impure now for the next few days and wash themselves and all those kind of things. And so she's probably put under a lot of social, pressure and stigma to not be there in the first place, to not even seek healing in such a crowded situation with Jesus. And so she's got her reasons to be afraid, and she just tells the truth, and she's like, this is why I came. I was so desperate. And Jesus affirms her, and he says, daughter, go in peace, you be healed, all these kind of things. And Jairus is there, anxiously, come on, hurry up, let's go. We've got seconds, and she could die at any moment now. And he's just anxious and worried and needing things to hurry along. And Jesus is just taking his leisurely time to engage with this woman and do one thing at a time. And then we see, let me just quickly check all my notes for a second. So from this moment, I'm going to read it so I don't get it wrong. So Jesus says to the woman, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. And while he was still speaking, so Jesus is talking to this woman, some guy from Jairus' family comes running up to Jairus and says, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any longer? All hope is lost, basically. And so I can imagine Jairus is just crestfallen and is like, I did what I could. I went to see Jesus, and now Jesus is taking his sweet time and, wasting his time with this woman who's bleeding and making everyone impure and all that kind of stuff. And then somebody comes along and tells him, it's too late now. And he's like devastated, why did I even bother? And as soon as Jesus hears this, he turns to Jairus immediately, and he speaks for the first time to Jairus, that we can see at least. And he says, do not be afraid, only believe. So I'm seeing this theme coming out of this story. It's all about faith. We see Jairus's level of faith to begin with. We see this woman's faith to be healed, and now Jesus is encouraging him to have even more faith. So he's just seen Jesus work right in front of him, And even though he's got all these emotions going on about his own situation, he's seeing the power of faith and how, you know, this woman didn't need to speak or to actually like talk to Jesus. She just needed to have faith that it would work. And Jairus is seeing this. Maybe he's not processing it in that moment mentally because of his own emotions, but Jesus is like, have faith, just believe, don't be scared. This is all going to be okay. And so from that point on, he permitted no one to follow him except his 3 closest mates, Peter, James, and John. And he comes to the house and he tells everyone to, you know, stop crying. It's okay. The girl's just sleeping. She's not dead. And they start laughing at him. Now, if you don't have a lot of understanding about what's going on here, the people who are mourning are paid mourners, most likely. And so that explains why they can go immediately from mourning to laughing at Jesus. Like, they're wailing and crying and make a commotion. And then as soon as Jesus says something a little bit ridiculous, they're like, you're dumb and we're gonna laugh at you because that's the stupidest thing we've heard all day. Can you get this guy? Like, he's just saying she's sleeping. We are professional mourners. Like, we go and cry and wail at everyone's dead person's bedside. We know what a dead person looks like. This girl is dead, right? So that's sort of the perspective they're coming from. And their perspective is just affirming this idea that she's dead, and that's the opposite of what you need when you need faith. When you need faith for life, the opposite thing that you want to have around you is people saying, no, the situation is dead. And so Jesus sends the people with that perspective coming out of their mouths, he sends them away. He even doesn't allow 9 of, you know, the disciples to follow him around. He just has the 3 who are his closest friends who really get him as much as they can to follow and to watch what goes on. And so he comes in and he does what Jairus asks. He lays hands. He takes this little girl by the hand and he says, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately, the thing that Jairus asked for with the level of faith that he had in the beginning of the story, his faith is realized. And immediately the daughter wakes up and she asks for food. And she walks around and yeah, the faith is fulfilled, I guess, is a good way to put it. So what I see happening here is the incident with the woman was to demonstrate to Jairus the power of faith, to grow and strengthen Jairus's own faith. So sometimes when we are asking something from God and we're like, God, please come through for me, it might not happen immediately, and it might be that we encounter situations and a waiting period that is meant to actually strengthen and grow our faith in the process. So it's not just about the healing or the deliverance or whatever it is that we're looking for. It's actually about us growing in our trust and our relationship with God. So my final point is that Jesus doesn't ever really run anywhere. We never see him running. He's always just walking and he's taking things slowly and he does everything one thing at a time. He seems to have no sense of urgency, and yet the healing and the deliverance that we're seeking always comes. Even with like, what's his best friend? Lazarus. You know, Lazarus was dead for 4 days before Jesus finally turned up, and yet that ended up strengthening the faith of Mary and Martha in the long run and, you know, showing God's power. These occasions keep happening throughout the Bible and in our own lives where, you know, we want something to happen now before, you know, the worst thing possible does end up happening, but then God drags his feet in our mind. He's doing his own thing. He's going at his own pace that he ordains, and we have to just sort of put up with it. And sometimes our hope can be dashed and we think that all hope is lost, and yet Jesus says, don't be afraid, only believe, only have faith. So our faith is strengthened in the meantime and through this process. So yeah, that is the story that I have for you today. I pray and I hope that you got something good out of it. Let me know in the comments below what you learnt, and if you want some more mission stories in the future, I'll see what I can throw in for the next one. Anyway, that's all for today. Have a lovely day and a peaceful and relaxing weekend. I'll see you next week. Bye!